start, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask Jaime to show his video and introduce himself briefly to all of you. Then he'll go off the video so that we're not distracted by him or the bandwidth, and then he'll go and present. You can ask questions along the way, but we ask you to do it by using the chat window just below the slides. I'm going to be taking notes of your questions and then ask them to Jaime on your behalf. We're going to have a break around slide number 12, and we'll ask you if you have any questions at that time, and then we can wait until the end of his presentation for any more questions. But do keep them coming, and I'll take note of them as they come along. If you have any problem with the audio or the video, we recommend that you check your headphones, volume, etc. But also, if it doesn't work, sometimes it's just easier to log off the webinar and log in right away. If you don't worry, you won't have missed anything because we are recording this webinar and it will be uploaded to the On Think Tank's YouTube channel right after this. Well, a few minutes after this. We'll let you know as soon as that happens. Okay, so Jaime, off to you.
Thank you, Enrique. Hi, hello everybody. Please let me know if you have any problem listening to the audio. My name is Jaime Gonzalez-Capitel, and today I'm going to present part of my work, the work that I did at Georgetown University thanks to a Fulbright grant in the last 2 years, and specifically from, let's say, initial conversations around the last summer and then the more intensive work of conducting the research between February and May of this year. I thank Enrique for giving me the stage of this webinar and being able to present to people from all over the world interested in this particularly difficult topic in a way. All right, so if the audio is bad, I think we might try without the video. Let me know if it works without the video, or if it's not loud enough, I can just. Is it any better now? Okay.
Yes, but you still have the video on, Jaime.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, just keep giving feedback if any of you don't can understand or can hear me. All right. Yeah. So welcome again, everyone. Thank you for making time in your busy agendas for listening to the presentation. The findings that I'm going to cover are part of my master's thesis for the MA Communication, Culture, and Technology at Georgetown University. And specifically in this presentation, I will focus on the practices of policy research evaluation that I was able to identify and document. Giving a brief overview of the webinar, I will cover the very basics of the study, how I came to the research question and what my methodologies were. Go over to the definition of evaluation, what do we understand by evaluation policy research, in case anybody in the audience is unfamiliar with the term or with how I frame it. And then I will move to the organization types. First to how foundations understand evaluation and how think tanks usually react to those demands. After that, we will have a break for the questions, and I will follow up with the best practices. I have selected 8 best practices in total. All right, you can start asking, making any observations as soon as you have any comments. So when I first looked at, oh, this is a little distracting. Okay, is it? I will keep up the volume. Thank you. So when I first started looking at the relationships between foundation and think tanks, the first problem here is making generalizations because each organization is a world in its own. Can you hear me better now? I'm sorry that this is being difficult. All right. So I was able to identify two facts. First, that foundations are a very strong donor for think tanks in the US, as the table shows in the left. And secondly, that the main strategy, that the main tool that foundations have to understand the return on their investments is with evaluation studies. So putting these two facts together and asking about how foundations understand the value of think tanks, I came to the research question, which is how is public policy research evaluated at the intersection of foundations and think tanks? My hypothesis is that think tanks are more likely to evaluate their work when they receive foundational funds. Aminata, can you hear me a little bit better now? I'm trying to hold the mic as close as possible. I had two additional hypotheses that I'm not going to cover because they were not supported. All right. I conducted two methods, basically a content analysis to understand what type of practices both think tanks and foundations publish on their websites, and then to cover practices that were not transparent to the public, I did a series of semi-structured interviews. And then go into the definition. What do we understand by evaluation of policy research? Well, what I understand by it was impact evaluation. So we're not talking about evaluating the quality of research, which is something that a lot of think tanks do. And we're not talking about looking at processes. We are trying to assess the outcomes and impact resulting from conducting and disseminating public policy research. And this is a very difficult topic for a series of reasons. The research process is very controlled. You know your resources, your timelines, and you can explain findings very accurately. You can also control your message as you disseminate it. But it's very hard to find out who reads what, how they think about it, and how that knowledge modifies their attitudes and behaviors. The problem of using research in this sense has been explained through the metaphor of the communities of policymakers and researchers, where the former have a problem-based mindset and the second a knowledge-based one. Which means that rather than by direct application, knowledge influences through a process of enlightenment, gradual enlightenment, in virtue of which new blocks of knowledge come into the realm of what is commonly known. And in this process, they also become anonymized. Once something becomes commonly known, it doesn't have an author anymore. It's a common knowledge. So it's extremely unlikely to be able to link a study to a decision. What works also, and what think tanks are good at, is the circulation of ideas through personal bonds and intermediary organizations. And that's an interesting point of contact for starting evaluation. Moving now to the perspective of foundations, this is just a sketch of the grant-making cycle, which is much more than just writing checks. Most foundations have a series of reporting requirements, but they are usually aimed at measuring activities and outputs, which leaves outcomes and impact as untapped questions. And the way that foundations have to try to gauge this is with extraordinary efforts to study through evaluation research what have been these outcomes and these impacts. The usual tool, of course, is the logic model, which is conditional. And, if you don't have one, you don't have the resources, you can't get to the activities. If you don't get to the outputs, you won't get the outcomes. But of course, the outputs are not a sufficient condition for the outcomes. However, despite some skepticism in this ground, I want to quote a response of Jackie Kay from World Student Advisor, because I think she framed very well the problem of evaluating specifically policy research. What it comes down to is, are we asking the right questions? In terms of policy research, I would probably ask the same for evaluation questions, and I do believe that they could be equally effective. There is nothing in public policy research that makes you start with something else. And those questions are, what do we want to accomplish? How do we get there? How do we know that we get there? What do we want to learn? What should we put in place to make sure that we learn that so we can build on it later? And for policy research specifically, what do we want to read? Who do we want to read, sorry? And did we reach them effectively? Beyond those questions, another dimension that is crucial is, I'm sorry with the, perhaps we can try without the mic, and we might have more quality. I don't know about that. Enrique, what do you want to do? I keep reading that people can hear me. All right, yeah, if it's just a matter of volume and not quality, I can chat a little bit, but is it any better like this? Okay, yeah. Sorry then about the last slides. Perhaps we can catch up with the comments later. Great. Okay, shouting works. That's great news. All right. So I was commenting on another important dimension, which is scale. When conducting policy research evaluation or evaluation in general, think tanks and foundations have a very different scale. Think tanks obviously look at their own portfolio, at the products and their programs. And however, the portfolio scale for foundations is much larger. For them, policy analysis and research is just one among the many types of tactics that you can deploy, as you can see in this map by Julie Kaufman and Tahir. So foundations usually don't expect policy research to move the needle alone. They recognize that it's a limited effort. However, at least in advocacy efforts, they do expect to find a solid research base to inform and galvanize. When that piece is missing, the assumption is that you don't have the knowledge base to make a persuasive argument, and therefore that the campaign is likely to fail. Good. Now moving to the think tank responses. Usually, and also in the literature, if you read Andy Rich's book, if you read Donald Abelson, and so on, you're going to see that think tanks use a lot of indicators of influence. And those are mostly output indicators, visibility indicators. Outputs include, of course, publication. Mainly books are the main driver for academic impact. Events, as we saw, the personal element is very important for transmitting ideas and knowledge. And they also look at visibility, which is a very important proxy for influence, although it's not synonymous. And I want to underscore that. Visibility and influence are correlated, but they're not synonymous. So you can look at your web visits or at the number of op-eds and citations that a think tank gets, but that doesn't mean that their ideas are influential among policymakers necessarily. A third factor is impact, and in that area, I was able to identify, and this belongs to method number 1, to the content analysis of annual reports of think tanks. Only 2 types of indicators: congressional testimonies, in which obviously, well, you have an expert talking to policymakers in a formal environment, that is very, very likely to have an important impact on decisions. And stories of impact, which are a very broad term that I use to describe usually narrative accounts of situations in which a program of a think tank had an effect on the policymaking world. However, these are not constructed in a very homogeneous way, as you can imagine. There are claims about that impact, but they may be true. They may not be as true as they claim to be, and they may be quite anecdotal. Moving to the second method, And after this, we will make the break and we can catch up a little bit of what I said before in case you didn't get it. I was able to interview, I didn't give the numbers, only 6 people from think tanks and 12 people from foundations plus another 6 people from evaluation firms or independent evaluators. Among the think tanks that I interviewed, and I exclude here IDRC, their capacity as managers of the think tank initiative, I had 2 negative responses regarding the basic question of whether those think tanks conducted evaluation studies. 2 negative responses and 3 positive ones. However, I want to point out that obviously there is a positive bias. People that decided to accept the interview with me for the project was more likely to be involved in this type of practice already. So the 3-2 ratio is obviously not representative. However, we can see it looking as a representative of the standard position, arguing influence with a combination of quantitative versus qualitative metrics, and having discussions about whether you can compare the impact that 30 op-eds have with a 15-minute conversation with the president. And the response is that probably you can. So there's an interesting tension there. The Urban Institute also does not conduct evaluation of their own work in terms of impact evaluation, but I will cover them as one of the practices because of their policy advisory unit, which in part confirms the hypothesis. And then we have 3 other think tanks that did confirm it. Water, sorry. They are all anonymized because I gave the option of not disclosed, not relating the identity of the organization to the specific responses that were given. So C has an internal evaluation unit that conducts evaluation both for internal projects and for third parties. Quite advanced and developed stage. D and E, on the contrary, are currently building their capacity. However, they are in very quite contrary situations, I would say. D is currently building their capacity with an earmarked grant from a foundation. Basically, they got this grant to build a logic model. Once it's built, they will use it for 3 years, also use it for general fundraising purposes. And after those 3 years, they will bring an evaluator on board to look at the situation. And E, on the contrary, it's another think tank that has ties with foundations and is currently trying to build their capacity through an extraordinary effort of some of their managers. They don't have financial resources allocated to this. They don't have formal buy-in from the board. However, they are trying to create data collecting systems and trying to create streamlined methods to make arguments based on that collected data and use it to persuade funders about their results. All right, so that was the end of the first part. I apologize again for the microphone, but if it's working with this level of volume, we'll keep with it. And we will take questions now through the chat. All right, if nobody has questions, I will proceed. Perhaps give a minute to people to think. Enrique, do you have any comments? All right. All right, just making sure, giving 10 seconds to see if anybody starts writing. Okay, then. Hi, Dustin. So, experimental or quasi-experimental impact evaluation, I think that is there were some people trying to think along those lines, but I don't think that the evaluations that I knew of were very much on the quantitative. There was one interviewee. There was one interviewee that commented about the possibility of running controlled experiments in which you basically offer two versions of the same information, one of them in hard copy, another of them in a video, and then using different groups and trying to determine how much information they got from it and how much they can remember after a certain time. But that was just an idea that this person expressed. It's Jackie Kay, the one that I quoted before, and she said in general that evaluation can learn a lot from strategic communication, and it's also possible to connect it to this type of more experimental approaches. So, Julia, that's a good question. In general, I think most of them expressed some skepticism about the possibility of even designing evaluations of policy research. They also expressed the wish to know more about how they could do it, but I think the perception that that evaluation is very hard to do and is perhaps an excessive demand from foundations is very widespread. So, Marta, I'm not sure about your comment. Can you elaborate on that a little bit, please? All right. Well, perhaps we can pick that up later. Yeah, okay. I'm going to move on now to the rest of the presentation, and we can keep talking afterwards, okay? So Marta, just hold that thought for the second part. Thank you. So I'm going to move now to the practices. I'm going to start with some of these are organizations and others are approaches. Okay. First, let's start with the Macarthur Foundation. I think they have a very interesting approach, very sophisticated, and they recognize that in many cases it's very important to talk always about contributing to a certain issue. And their evaluations can be done, but it's very difficult for them to establish causal links. So there are certain always has to be taken with cum salis. Macarthur Foundations, for that reason, they don't conduct evaluations at a very summative level, at the program level. They don't want to frame whether a given organization has failed or succeeded, but they approach evaluations to address four levels of knowledge needs: landscape, process, outcomes, and impacts. Landscapes are about understanding the context, the social and environmental conditions, and how they change over time and space, and really being able to follow external variables that can pose a threat, or that have to be followed in relation to a certain issue. Then process is about a more programmatic work in contact with the grantees and really looking at whether the program is following as expected. Outcome evaluations are very sophisticated and they require a lot of fieldwork. It's not just about measuring the impacts on past legislation, but also a level below the legislation, like in proposals, debates, etc. Measuring public sentiment through public polling, scanning the media, and also analyzing political discourses in environments that are transparent, that are either published or that you have videos or so on, things that can be followed directly. And last, their understanding of impact, in a way, it's a symmetrical notion to that of landscape. Because what Chantal Jensen said is, quote, that we define a number of variables that can observe movement along trend lines and examine if and how we or others are contributing over time. I'm going to move now to a specific approach that I know Julia Cavan knows very well, the Bellwether Methodologies, first formulated in the Harvard Family Research Project. Bellwether Methodologies were designed in the field of advocacy. So their use for policy research evaluation is a borrow. It's really borrowing something that doesn't adapt immediately, but it can be beneficial in certain ways. So bellwethers are informants, are informed players from 6 fields: policymakers, advocates, think tanks and academia, media, business representatives, and funders. And these methodologies are interviews aimed at determining how saliently an issue has become in the agenda. But it's very important in this method that the interview directly asks, so informants are not aware of the specific issue that the interview is going to be about. So when they give a list of salient issues, they are unprimed. Their responses are more or less spontaneous. So a list of questions would be, what 3 issues are at the top of the agenda? Under the circumstances, do you think that the policy should be adopted? And so it's slowly creeping into the informant's awareness to see what their knowledge is about a certain issue. Moving now to another foundation that is, will remain confidential again. They do have an advocacy foundation, and they share with Macarthur composed approach to evaluation. They have different typologies. Summative evaluations for them are conducted at the end of a program to see whether the objectives have been met. Strategic evaluations are conducted midterm to allow for strategic shifts, and they have both a summative and a learning aspect. Tactical evaluations are very interesting, I think, for this topic, because they're usually for research-based programs with an exploratory approach, without a policy goal in mind, and this is an advocacy-oriented foundation. So first, a team of researchers conduct a study or conducts a project, and after that, the evaluator looks at what did the policymakers or the target audience think about it, whether it was useful for them, and whether they really used it, right? And after that, that program can grow by adding a policy goal and taking it further. And then retrospective evaluations that are connected in a way to the concern of the Macarthur Foundation to measure the landscape and the evolutions along time. This foundation has exited from certain issues, and the exit strategy was based on assumptions that some things were going to happen. So after 5 or 6 years, those assumptions are tested, and that is a further evidence base for the board and for the decision makers inside the foundation to be able to approach that issue in the future, to decide whether it was a good decision to exit. I want to talk then about the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for 2 reasons. One, because they only fund research, and they have a very sophisticated approach to evaluation. They talk about a triangle of research, evaluation, and learning. That's a constant to their work. So this is a positive answer to whether research can be evaluated in terms of its dissemination, its outcomes. And the second reason why I want to name this foundation is because they have applied social network analysis to evaluation, at least in two contexts. In determining the personal networks of researchers, because that's a very important path beyond just publishing a report or presenting at a conference. The people that researchers know and approach personally are also bearers of a message or can become that. And secondly, they also use it to identify gaps in outreach for advocacy efforts. So the interviewee in this case told me that they had a conversation with a partner, and they showed them the results of social network analysis, and they showed them how certain minority groups had been touched by their campaign, which is a very important learning point in order to reassess what can be done further in that area. I want to talk too about the think tank initiative, which is a peculiarity here because they are it's think tanks in developing countries, but they have Hewlett as one of their main funders, and they have some very interesting points. Firstly, there is a tension between offering unrestricted funding and setting specific objectives for the think tanks. That is quite contrary to what happens in the US, which means that it doesn't necessarily have to happen. It's just a tradition or a trend. But in the US, usually evaluations are tied to restricted funding, to using money for a very specific project. Secondly, the TTI has a very distinct separation between monitoring the activities of the grantees with a series of indicators and conducting evaluation at the level of the overall program. And then the question is not whether a certain think tank had certain influence, it's whether the TTI program achieved its objectives. And lastly, TTI has had a very strong approach to stories of influence, to highlighting the success of their grantees with prominent examples that are very similar to the impact indicator that I showed for the think tanks in the US with my first method. Another best practice was the 2006, and this is more of a bibliographical practice. This is a case study that I conducted, but I didn't talk to anybody at CGD. However, I think it's a milestone in terms of really conducting and publishing a very serious evaluation, organization-wide, of a think tank. It was conducted 5 years after the creation of CGD. It surveyed the opinions and the reputation of the center among advocates and policymakers. And it also contained case studies of major projects in which the evaluators looked at the process in order to include possible criticisms and to analyze what could have been done differently in a more inclusive manner and so on. Basically, I see two reasons for conducting this evaluation. First, it offers a mirror image of the center in the eyes of the main the target audiences, advocates and policymakers in this case. And secondly, it's also, in a way, a PR tactic for the CGD. I think it was important to appear as a very open institution, as a think tank that wanted to be as transparent as possible, even to the point of exposing itself to criticism and publishing those results. And lastly, I'm going to cover two examples that, in a way, are counterexamples. If usually the impact evaluation that I have talked about and that I have interviewed about goes from the research product to the use or to the impact. In these two best practices, the direction is the contrary. It goes, or it tries to design the project from the user to the research. So the Urban Institute created about 3 years ago, I think, 2 years ago even, the Policy Advisory Group. It has thriven inside the organization. It has grown a lot because they have a lot of foundational funding. And I want to remind that the Urban Institute is its main funder is actually the government, the American government, in different levels, federal, local, and state level. They usually conduct evaluation of public policy programs for the government, and then the circulation of knowledge is much more direct. There is a direct user, and there is almost a customer relationship to knowledge use. However, this advisory group has had an even more interventionist approach with trying to understand the knowledge needs of policymakers and trying to connect the products to the players in a very direct way. For example, in one of their areas of expertise is the Pay for Success programs. So what they try to do is circumvent the problem of determining how influential research is and going directly to conversations with policymakers around highly technical implementation questions. So it's perhaps more about giving advice than about doing research in a more traditional way. And on the foundation side, this same approach or a similar approach can be represented by the William T. Grant Foundation. They do work as well as the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. They only grant research, and they do work in the field of youth education. And since 2009, they have moved to what they call an ecological approach to research use. With that grant portfolio, they sought to understand how and under what conditions research is used, particularly by local decision makers, including, for example, school directors. And in the current RFP, they are trying to get researchers to think, even in a more interventionist way, on how to improve research use in three directions. One, testing strategies to increase use. Secondly, testing strategies to create more useful evidence. And thirdly, and this I think is very interesting as a principle, discussing the assumption that decisions based on research are better decisions, because there's a lot of literature, if you look at it, about tactical use of research, about the use of research as ammunition. And I think any good think tank or any serious organization tends to avoid that type of use. All right, this is the end of the 8 case studies. We will now be taking questions. I thank you all for your patience with the volume, but I hope that you understood most of my points.
Thank you, Jaime. This is Enrique again. Thank you, Jaime, very much for this excellent presentation. I think we got the hang of the volume in the end. Are there any questions from the participants? We have 17 participants, so I expect there will be some questions. I was gonna ask one and get people started. In your opinion, what do you think are the best approaches to evaluating policy research, or the ones that you found more interesting and more appealing?
Well, I really like the Bellwether methodology, because I think it's very straight. It can be done in a very straightforward manner. Of course, it has to be adapted to the issue and so on. It might be difficult to determine interesting informants from those 6 areas. I think it's very straightforward to apply it. And that is, of course, a good thing of it. I also think that the tactical evaluation as and that they're combined, of course. You could say that tactical evaluations can be in the form of bellwether methodologies, and using that as a feedback, you can keep planning. I think beyond just making the argument, and I think this is where the field is moving really, beyond trying to make the argument to persuade funders that a certain organization is uh, is valid and their work is good. Um, the benefits of the evaluation can be in uh, internalizing it for strategic planning. And that can only happen if we don't conduct it at the end, ex post factum, but if we conduct it as a point moving forward. So it's a matter probably of thinking beyond the, uh, the design of research as a isolated effort, and thinking of connecting that isolated effort with other programs inside the same organization, or with campaigners and advocates outside the think tank.
Thank you. Any more questions? I see Julia Kaufman is typing. So Julia asks, did you interview any of the newer think tanks that operate a little differently than the older, larger institutions?
I don't think I did um, interview any of those newer think tanks, if I know what Julia is thinking of. I did interview, however, um, one of the think tanks that I interviewed was creating a new unit, a new institute side of the think tank. And in that case, for them, it was much easier to create those. It was the case which was creating the logic model with neural front. In that case, for them, it was easier to break the inertia and to start thinking systematic. But unfortunately, no, I wasn't able. Policy Link, for example, was one of the institutions that I tried to reach out to. Wasn't successful. I was also not successful in talking to CGD people. I would love to do that. So yeah, I think that there is much room for further research in terms of identifying existing practices and identifying new approaches to research design that to this question. Mm.
So Simon asks, at the outset you said that you thought advocacy-oriented think tanks might be less inclined to engage in evaluation. I realize you haven't done specific research on this, but it'd be interesting to know what made you have this thought.
So I may have failed to convey the message, because I think advocacy-oriented think tanks um, have it much easier to engage in evaluation, because they don't only have the policy goals, but they think in strategic ways beyond just the dissemination of knowledge. And that's precisely what evaluation can be used for thinking strategically and testing those strategies, right? So I think, in fact, for example, that foundation that had to remain confidential, which is a pity. But they do have an advocacy orientation, and they do conduct a lot of evaluation studies. And one of the things that I forgot to mention for that foundation specifically is that the person that I talked to thought that the best teams that can connect research to its outcomes are multidisciplinary teams that have second um, are teams that have researchers, campaigners, communicators, and government relations experts. And when you have this composition, you have the people creating the knowledge, you have the people that know how to disseminate the knowledge, you have the campaigners that have a very strategic way of thinking, and the experts in government relations. So you are, through them, you can connect very directly to the policymaker. There's this multidisciplinary composition. Sometimes usually don't have it because they don't have the muscle or they don't have the team build out, but they could work on that, I think. All right. There is another couple of questions. I'm going to go in order. Aminat asked, I quite appreciate the social network analysis. Studies have shown that policymakers tend to rely on their networks to make decisions. However, while the analysis tells you your potential for impact, I am not sure it tells you anything about your real impact. What are your thoughts on this? I'm not an expert in SNA, and I think that a lot still has to be developed in terms of framing good indicators and understanding really how to use the measurements for the benefit of our purpose, which is exactly to know what is their real impact. You can go through a negative approach, which is what I think I explained, in terms of understanding the people you didn't reach out to, and you perhaps didn't know that you had failed to be listened by them, right? So it can be a stepwise process. You can see which audiences have been untapped, and then what other methodologies to ask more directly, because SNAs combined with interviews may be an interesting combination. Vanessa Malida asked whether I think these best practices can be used in other contexts outside of the US, or whether I think that some are best suited to the way public policy research takes place in the USA or other global north countries. I am not sure about the answer on that topic. I think the problem with evaluation is that though it can be very useful very often, it's also very costly, right? So think tanks on their own usually don't have the muscle to conduct it. And they do it because foundation asks them. And that's why foundations are a driver, because they can give specific grants for evaluation, although they are very rare. That's a big problem. But the think tanks that decide on their own that they have to tackle this issue and they have to raise their capacity are rare because of the financial, because of the cost evaluations have. And if you export that to other countries, of course, you're going to have funding issues as well. I guess there might be, potentially, I don't see the problem in the public policy context. I see it more in the amount of knowledge and critic mass that you can reach. All right. So Marta asked, which would be the most important improvements think tanks should apply in order to increase their impact in policies and society? Well, I think that goes beyond the scope of my project. I think evaluation is an interesting tool. I think that collaborating with advocates is another interesting tool. And one of my, let's say, ideological components in the research was to try to debunk the myth that think tanks should, above all, be non-partisan, that they should, above all, be valueless. I think research is not valueless, so that relates to the transparency of the brand of an organization. Of course, there's ways of being partisan. There's ways of values, and there's intelligent ways in which you can um, support good practices in doing valuable research and also connect to people that can use it. If you don't connect to people that can use your research, I don't see the reason to continue.
Thank you, Jaime. I don't know if there's any more questions, but we're just about to run out of time. So let me add one more, and if there's one more question, we can answer that. Mine is a bit of a reflection. I wonder what you think. I have the sense that think tanks that receive funding from foreign funders, so answering the question about developing country context, for example, think tanks that receive funding from foreign funders have a greater pressure from those funders to evaluate the impact of their research than think tanks that receive funding specifically from politically savvy or politically oriented funders who are closer to, as you mentioned, parties or partisanship, and who will demand a bit less evaluation from those think tanks they fund. My sense is that those who are closer to politics know the context better, and therefore know ex ante that the think tanks they are supporting are influential. Whereas think tank funders that are far away, that are funding in another country, or that are probably more interested in academic research, know that political context a lot less, and therefore are not aware or not sure if the think tanks they're funding are influential already. What do you think?
So yes, I agree on what you say, of course, with an important nuance. Um, And I'm gonna make a note before I start talking because there's another thing I say that forget about this. Um, so one of the ideas that has been important for U.S. think tanks and for the relationship with foundations is that um, there is a chasm between how liberal foundations operate and how conservative foundations operate. This is very particular of the U.S. context. So there are differences inside the U.S. Of course, as I have that question that phrase at the beginning, when you know a foundation, you only know a foundation, so it's very difficult to go into generalizations. But generally, conservative foundations do not have the tendency to evaluate the work of the organizations that they fund them because they believe in their mission. Whereas liberal foundations have a much more, perhaps because they stem, if you think of the Gates Foundation, if you think of Bullet, I think they all come from, many of them come from an environment in which, well, related to corporate ideas, in which showing results is extremely important. And it's very important to be savvy about the return on your investments, right? So for that reason, Hewlett and Gates and also Johnson had an extremely sophisticated approach conducting evaluation to determine whether there are results or not. So that pressure to think tanks also exists in the US. However, it depends also on how think tanks are perceived. Sometimes they're not perceived as other grantees, and that pressure is relieved from them. Very often they are conceived as partners that are great for convening, that are great to establish solid networks, to run good events. they're thought of also as institutions that anchor a certain field. We have, if you think of Brookings, you're probably not asking Brookings to prove their impact because you know SAS already, where it's a prime. So there's that mixed approach. So there's a chasm between liberal and conservative. Also, there is a question. If the think tank already has a very strong reputation, it can be it can serve as an anchor institution. If it's a think tank that works very close to the political process, for example, Heritage, some other very advocacy-oriented organizations, and you already know that they do that kind of thing, and they probably are very also savvy in showing who did they meet with, how they impacted positions like. All right, so it's 3:58. You have perhaps we have time for another comment. If not, thank you so much for participating, for listening to it. You have my email on the screen. If you have comments or observations, if you want any other details about the thesis and
Thank you, Jaime. That was great. Thank you everybody for joining and for asking questions and for listening very attentively to Jaime's presentation. As I said, I've been recording this webinar, so we will edit it very briefly just to cut the beginning and the end and upload it to our YouTube page where you can find other videos and how-to notes and past webinars that we've tried with other technologies not always working. I hope this works better in the future. I just want to remind you that this is an open series, so we're being very opportunistic in these webinars. If you have an idea for a webinar, if you'd like to organize one, just like Jaime has done, please get in touch. I'm sure you can find me. I'll put my email here where you can write to us and let us know that you're interested or that you think you know somebody who might be. And we will be delighted to organize this for you. If you've got a paper to present, a study to show, or a method to show to peers and get some feedback, we would be very happy to do that as well. So thank you again. Thank you, Jaime. Have a good day. Good evening for those who are on the other side of the Atlantic. And I hope to talk to you soon. Bye.
everybody. Thanks, Enrique. Bye.